So let's talk a little bit in this video about what your soil actually has, right? I feel like that's such an important topic because even the soil tests and the way we look at them, we're led to believe, oh, I got 200 or 300 or 400 pounds of potassium, I got 100 pounds of phosphorus in this 0 to 6 inch zone across 1 acre that I soil sampled. It was a moment for me a few years ago, or maybe longer than that now, where all of a sudden I kind of stopped and I was looking at a soil sample and it said elemental on there, very small letters. What that means is what we're really measuring is just the elemental nutrients. That's the phosphorus, that's the nitrogen that's actually available for the plant to absorb, right? That's not the total amount in the soil. And so then that took me back to my college textbook and I went, okay, well, is there more? And how much more? And the answer is, yeah, a lot. What we see on the elemental side is a very small percentage, 1% or less of what's actually in the ground. And this, once again, this is not opinion. You can go look this up and if you've got an old college textbook, you could dust off and you'll find exactly what I'm about to tell you, which is Midwest soils in the United States, on average, are made up of about 3% potassium. We're talking topsoils, the A horizon here, and about 1.5-ish% of phosphorus. Okay, cool. What's that mean, right? So if you take 6 inches across 1 acre of soil and you remove the moisture, and so you're left with just the dry weight, because that's what that percentage is referencing. What is that in pounds? So 1 acre of dried soil, 6 inches deep, weighs about 2 million to 2.2 million pounds, depending on overall composition. 3% of that means you've got roughly 80,000 pounds of potassium in the ground. And I went, holy cow, that's nuts. So same for phosphorus. If you're around even just 1%, right, we're looking at 20,000 pounds of phosphorus in the first 6 inches. I was like, hang on just a minute. So how much does a corn crop remove whenever we just take the grain off? The conservative working number that we have, just based on breaking it down to an atomic level and looking at actually structurally what's in there, is per bushel, you're removing about 1/2 pound of phosphorus and about 1 pound of potassium out of soybeans, right? So that means if I take that soybean crop off, I'm removing about, anywhere from 50 to 70 pounds of potassium and 25 to, 35 pounds of phosphorus. I was like, okay, if I had access to all 80,000 pounds of potassium, how many years then would it take for me to use up what I have? And the answer is hundreds of years. When you contrast that, and we'll come back to that because I know I just dropped a bomb on that, but when you contrast that with an NPK industry that's been around for 70 years and is estimated to have about 30 years before we're in a bad spot. It's about 100 years. Already, just in that first 6 inches, if we just knew how to use what we already have, what we already paid for when we bought the land, instead of applying synthetics, I could farm 3, 4, 5 times as long, and my kids and my kids and my kids after that, versus our current approach. So I was like, well, this already seems like a better idea. Not to mention, I already own it. Why am I paying for more? Why can't I just use that? If I'm sitting on this massive oil reserve, why can't I use what I got instead of going to the gas station, right? That then brings in the actual process of how God designed the plant and the soil to function together. So let's talk about that for a minute. So here you have common Midwestern soil, or anywhere in the United States soil for that matter. For now, let's just call it the Midwest, right? In this soil, you have minerals. A lot of that's going to be silicate, right? But once again, as we said, 3% of that is going to be potassium, and let's just call it, for easy numbers, 1% is going to be phosphorus in there, right? So humans aren't here at this point, right? In comes Mr. Corn Plant, and he starts growing, right? And he starts putting down roots. The natural assumption is, okay, those roots go down, they absorb these minerals, and they grow, and then they reproduce, and they keep going. That's actually not how it's designed. So yes, they absorb the nutrients, but in order for those nutrients to be in an elemental form, there's something else that we're relying on there, right? That something else is all the little bacteria that lives in the soil and needs that plant in order to live. Because what that plant and that bacteria have is a relationship where one can't live without the other. That relationship is this. Mr. Microbe down here needs carbon in order to eat, reproduce, and live. Mr. Plant up here with his beautiful leaves has the ability to take in and create carbon through photosynthesis and through respiration. And therefore, he's got the building block. These guys need it. So what do? God created the system, so it's an exchange. Hey, I'll bring you nutrients, says Mr. Microbe, and you feed me carbon. And together, what you end up with is a symbiotic relationship here, right? And so what happens is this bacteria produces enzymes and amino acids that are able to mineralize soil, right? We into detail on that, extremely into detail on redox and the redox process. But essentially what they're doing is they're breaking that mineral down into elemental forms. Those elemental forms aren't just P and K, right? It's calcium, it's magnesium. Then you have your organic matter decomposers that are digesting organic matter to release nitrogen and sulfur. They all rely on each other for different elements that they need, while also feeding and relying on the plant that's able to give them the food that they need to live and to reproduce. It's a beautiful system. Here's what happens. When we come in and we put on the good old building blocks, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium of biological life, we gave the plant what it needed. The plant has more than it normally had, so now it's going to produce more. We're going to get more bushels of corn. We're going to get more bushels of soybeans, more bushels of wheat, right? More bales of cotton. Whatever that crop may be, now we can push that growth. Well, what happens, right? When we supply that to the plant, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, but I just want to make it clear. You gotta bear with me through all this to get to the final message. But when we supply that, this plant now says, hey, I got everything I need. And so it's signaling to the soil, I'm good. We're good. Don't feed me anymore. What happens? Carbon supply to the soil and sequestration from the atmosphere is diminished or almost entirely cut off because it's saying, oh, I don't need to feed you guys. I need it. I appreciate it. The issue then is now the ability for this population to exist decreases and diminishes. That takes us back to the point. Why is it that it seems like dry fertilizer doesn't work as well as it used to? Right? Well, because over the years, as we do this over and over and over again, and more of this population is told, hey, you don't need to be here, man. I got what I need. Go find somewhere else to live. You get less and less microbial activity, positive bacteria, mineralizing soil and releasing nutrients. What does that do, right? Makes us more and more reliant on this. It makes this less and less effective because when we put diammonium phosphate down, or when we put urea down, we actually need those microbes to convert that diammonium phosphate or monoammonium phosphate into an orthophosphate so the plant can use it, right? So now we're getting less absorption and less utility out of what we have. We're getting less mineralization out of what we already own, making this work less, making this not help us at all. And the lower the population, the lower your organic matter tends every year. Why? Because a lot of people have this idea that the majority of organic matter is old corn stalks or old bean plants that are breaking down in the soil. The vast majority of your organic matter is dead bacteria, right? They live, they reproduce, they die. That then is a biological substance, right? Organic substance that then contains more building blocks of life that can be recycled and reused. Things like sulfur, things like nitrogen, right? Those energy sources that aren't as readily available in the soil mineral itself. And so now with that being said, you see how this thing creates this negative loop, and those inputs are more and more negatively impacting our number one resource that we have. So then the question becomes, okay, well, if I have 80,000 pounds of potassium, if I have 10, 15, 20,000 pounds of phosphorus, and I could farm the rest of my life on this ground, and my kids could do the same, how do we do that, right? That's the next question, is how do we get back in and fix the system that we broke, right? And that is where a lot of the mindset and the approach comes in for AgriTec. The idea is you can't fully cut this off, right? We're too far into this chain on most of our ground to say, oh, I can just stop putting on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium all together and I'll be Gucci, right? The good news is by buildup of that soil, the lifespan of a microbe and the reproduction rate is a measurable thing. The nice thing is they reproduce extremely fast. Then you end up with a logarithmic equation that shows that you could take almost any piece of soil and in a matter of 3 to 4 years through soil conversion is what I like to call it, convert that soil back to a healthy, rich, nutrient-dense, elemental nutrient-dense environment, right? Year one, you can have a massive reduction on these two items, right? Not so much the nitrogen, right? Because once again, the nitrogen's not coming as much from the soil mineral as it is from organic matter. So you got to give that soil time to build that organic matter back up. But we can look at a soil type, and this is what we do. We look at the soil type, we look at where you're at, we look at the moisture, right? We look at the history of that ground. And from that, we're able to say, okay, if we are looking at this specific soil on this specific farm, how much potassium we can release. Now, here's the thing about that. That is not a fully reliant program right out the gate. So the approach then becomes, we want to get that plant started. We want to give it the phosphorus, especially the phosphorus it needs right out the gate to begin that growth process. Why? Because the first thing that a plant does is it uses that phosphorus to develop downward, to develop that root system and to build that rhizosphere. Rhizosphere is the zone underneath the plant within the root system in which it's able to control and feed and manipulate the environment. And that's really an interesting side topic, is the control a plant has over signaling through root exudates, over even mineralization through root exudates within its rhizosphere is phenomenal. A lot of people don't even realize that a plant will manipulate soil pH within its rhizosphere to control elementalization of different elements, right? To give itself a better environment for that nutrient to be sustained, right? So more acidic areas, when that plant releases, what it's releasing is root exudates and protons to acidify a zone. Now it's more stable for my phosphorus to function. Whereas later in its life, it needs more, it releases root exudates to neutralize that zone so that it has more potassium supply. Why? Well, these building blocks are what I like to simplify them as: energy is nitrogen, right? Phosphorus is function, and potassium is the building block, right? So what is that plant's primary goal in its life? It's to reproduce, right? It's to create seed that will create more plants that will continue on, right? First, it needs to develop strong process. First, the thing it's using that for is to develop the foundation to build that process off of it the rest of its life. Then later on, it's using that through the mid-growth stages is the second largest uptake time for phosphorus to really develop its ability to photosynthesize energy so that when it comes time to fill out a bean pod or to fill out an ear of corn, it has the energy it needs to do that process, right? And then the potassium is structural, right? It's supporting the structure of this growth along with calcium, right? Which is a massive building block. Also, side note with calcium actually makes up 5% or more in most Midwestern soils, which means whether you're looking at it from the standpoint of liming the ground or whether you're looking at it simply from the newer standpoint of cation exchange capacity and calcium base saturation to support better soil structure, health, and nutrient availability. When you get up to 5%, now we're talking about over 1,300 years worth of calcium in the first 6 inches alone. And that's the thing too, is we're talking about 6 inches, okay? There's studies just recently that have been done showing that taproots on corn can go down up to 8 feet to bring up other minerals, to bring up other things that it needs, or to feed microbes at a deeper level. Just to go back over, we're talking about energy, talking about process, right? Easy for the P, and then structure, right? And so early on, we want to feed those microbes. And so what we do here is we start that plant off with a readily available supply of orthophosphate to feed that initial process to develop that root system so that now we have a much larger rhizosphere that's extending down into the ground, have a much larger microbial network, and mineralize much more soil, okay? Second part of that is we now have to actually access this stuff, right? And we need these guys to do it. So part of that initial path, that initial blend, that initial fertility that sets us apart right now anyway from everybody else's approach is at the same time, we want to put things into the soil that are going to cause these guys to replicate at a very, very fast rate and much more than what the plant needs, right? Because the plant needs enough to make, 60, 70 bushel. We want it to make 250. So we need to push that. So what do? We apply amino acids, micronutrients, and enzymes that signal to that population, hey, here's the protein, right? Here's the building blocks of life that you need to replicate extremely quickly. What we're able to do is increase microbial population within days by 12 to 16,000%. Like I said, they replicate quickly. That's the beautiful thing about bacteria. But then you have to tell them, hey, this guy, right, who's still young, has a massive demand and he can feed you a bunch. So along with that, we want to put on a form of carbon, organic carbon, that is doing what this plant normally does. It's feeding that population out and saying, okay, let's go. Give me as much as you can, right? Much more than that plant normally would do. That then starts the process of allowing us to use much more of what we already have and support that by not just going, well, maybe I just need a different form of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Well, yeah, can we be smarter with how we apply that? Absolutely. And part of that being the understanding that phosphorus is immobile. So when you go across your field and you've got, 3, 4, 5 inches on each side and you got a 30-inch row, well, 5 plus 5 is 10. I got 20 inches in the middle of phosphorus that the plant's not even going to use this year, right? That's going to bind with aluminum, that's going to bind with iron to become part of this. So for years, you've been building this up, not by a lot because there was already a crap ton there, but you didn't even realize you were doing it. And part of the reason that happened is because when we developed the rates that we need to apply in order to grow a specific amount of bushels, the way that was done is the ag industry, I don't want to say specifically the USDA, I think it was, took 3,000 farms across the Midwest. And for 10 years, they tracked their inputs of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The idea there is we can wash out enough to really get a good, clean understanding of how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, and how much potassium it takes to grow X amount of bushels. It's not X amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. It's X amount of DAP and potash, right? And so now if we have studies that are showing that broadcast DAP has roughly a 10% utilization rate, that means 90% of the DAP that you put down or the MAP that you put down never actually made it into the plant and just got bound up in this. Now you go, oh dang, I'm putting on 10 times as much as I need just to get the little bit the plant will actually use. That's part of the reason why we want to get that where it's going to be used, right? Then we're getting the most out of it early on. That 3, 4, 5 gallon rate of something like 10, 20, 10, 3, 18, 18. Now that has a 90% plus utilization rate, is much more effective early on, giving that plant exactly what it needs to develop that growth so that then we can push that system around it to support it even better, right? To end up with this instead of just that. That gives you kind of the encapsulated how things work, how we kind of messed up the system, but how we manage it to get back to a point where we're letting the soil feed the crop for us, right? Feed the plant what it needs. And it's not just out the gate right here. You have to continuously feed that ground. And here's the interesting thing when you talk to a lot of companies or individuals that are big on regenerative ag or biology, they're like, oh, you got to cover crop, you got to do this, you can't use anhydrous, you got to do that. Need I remind you that in a matter of days, we can increase that population by 10, 15, 18,000%. You don't need to do all that. You just need to understand how and when to spike that population and then sustain it by artificially telling it, well, man, you're supporting an oak tree rather than a corn plant. We need way more to support the system here because this corn plant's giving you so much carbon. No, we're feeding it to sustain that population to produce way more. The result of that then becomes year after year now, these are building up organic matter as they cycle and die and come back. And you're seeing organic matter levels come back up, which is giving you more natural nitrogen supply, which is giving you more natural sulfur supply, right? Sulfur being a key component of the protein molecule, something that a lot of people miss. It's also giving more micronutrient supply, which is supporting the rest of the process in the plant. Fun fact, you cannot make vitamins without molybdenum, boron, sulfur, and magnesium. Stepping away from the corn and beans, if you're ever curious why we take so many dang pills now just to be healthy, well, it's because farming practices eliminated the need for the micronutrients because they didn't put dollars in the bank. Beauty of fixing this process is unintentionally, we're also fixing what we broke, which is a system that was supposed to sustain human life and animal life, giving not just humans better source of food and nutrients and vitamins, but also the livestock that we feed that corn to, that grass to. The more you get into this, which I'm not going to do and bore you with today, but the more you get into this, the more you see the domino effect this has had across not just the ag industry, but across our food sources and then to the own health of our bodies. So with that being said, in the next section, I'm going to talk a little more in detail about what our approach is, what those product names are for us, and how we use them. For now, this is the general idea of how we fix that system and get things back on track so the soil's working for us. We're getting more miles per gallon out of what we're using and able to take extremely high farm costs, cut them way down, and end up with better production, better soil, and better quality out of it.